This is Asian Insider, and I'm Nirmal Ghosh. We have this month been gifted by not one, but two excellent books, both on the implications in Southeast Asia of the rise of China. And I'm especially pleased to have both authors on board for what promises to be a great discussion. Hiebert, a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the CSIS here in DC, and head of research at Bauer Group Asia, is an old Southeast Asia hand. His book is called Under Beijing's Shadow, and he begins it with a first-hand recollection of the scene at Langson in February 1979, which was when tens of thousands of Chinese troops, well after the end of the Vietnam War, attacked Vietnam to punish it for invading Cambodia and throwing out the genocidal regime of the Khmer Rouge leader, Pol Pot. Sebastian Strangio, journalist and author who incidentally has written an excellent book on Cambodia's leader Hun Sen, also has a new book out called In the Dragon's Shadow, Southeast Asia in the Chinese Century. And his book starts with hundreds of Chinese tourists disembarking from a cruise ship at Subic Bay in the Philippines in January 2019. A world of difference between those two scenes, and yet fascinatingly connected, a reminder of cause and effect in a very complex region. Remember, it was partly out of its base at Subic Bay that the United States fought in Vietnam. So gentlemen, congratulations on your books, and we have a head-to-head of sorts here. How wonderful. So, both books very well timed and required reading, given that Southeast Asia is in this balancing act right now in the middle of an increasingly hostile US-China relationship. Murray, if I may start with you. Clearly, Beijing's shadow has lengthened considerably, and in fact, China has become critical to the economies of the region. What is the key takeaway from your research and from your book?
Well, I think, especially since, obviously, these countries have a very long history with China, but since China opened its economy in the late 1970s, the countries of Southeast Asia have benefited enormously from Chinese trade, and it's really helped fire up their middle-income economies. In some cases, they've gotten infrastructure projects. Tourists that you refer to in Sebastian's book. Those are have a big impact on the region's economy. But then there's like the long shadow is also there, and that's China is becoming more assertive in the South China Sea. We saw it again this year, even in the middle of COVID. And again this year, we're seeing drought in the lower Mekong countries. And China appears to be holding back water behind its 11 dams on the upper reaches of the Mekong. And then, of course, they're very worried about the increasing tensions between China and the United States. They really don't want to be squeezed.
Sebastian, we have the rise of China, of course, but we also have long-standing regional powers like Japan, South Korea. In Myanmar, for instance, it is not so much India and the US competing with China. It is Japan which competes with China. How has the rise and increasing reach of China affected the balance with respect to these other powers, military and economic or both?
Well, just as China's rise has been a cause of considerable consternation in Washington, D.C., the same is true of Tokyo, Seoul, Taipei, Canberra, probably to a certain extent Moscow as well. And what we've seen is, these powers move each in their own ways to provide a counterweight to China's increasing economic, political, and military heft. I should also have mentioned India, of course, even though it is to some extent a peripheral role at present. I think the most significant regional counterweight to China is offered by Japan, which is deeply engaged across the region and comes closest to meeting China's particular challenge on its own terms. The Japanese provide high-quality infrastructure. They engage pragmatically with the nations of the region. They offer huge amounts of development assistance. And they under Shinzo Abe, they've shown a very consistent, pragmatic engagement with the region. One example I might offer is that in the Philippines, the Abe government was probably the only government that managed to have good relations with both the Aquino administration and the administration of Rodrigo Duterte. And I think this testifies to the depth and breadth of the Japanese interactions with the Philippines and its engagement there, dating back to before the war, in fact. And so I think, yes, Japan has been described as the region's stealth superpower. It flies under the radar to a large extent, but it is doing quite a lot to offer the nations of the region an alternative to what China is offering.
Murray, back to you, and fast forwarding slightly to the future, if you will, because that is on everybody's minds right now. Of course, you would have completed your book before the coronavirus pandemic broke across the world, and that has changed the calculus, both within China and in terms of China's reputation abroad. What sense do you have of how Southeast Asia sees a Trump 2 administration, or conversely, a Joe Biden administration? What are they looking for?
Well, in a nutshell, they see a Trump 2 administration as being just a little bit more of Trump 1. And so they really do expect that trade tensions would continue, that probably there would be a push to bifurcate the global supply chain, bifurcate the technology sphere, as we've seen China, the U.S. making efforts to block WeChat and TikTok, and they had done and they're now talking about Alibaba also. If Biden is elected, we obviously don't know exactly, but Biden has a long history as the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and then also as vice president to President Obama. So there's an assumption that he would be more of an engager, that he'd be more multilateral, that he would like to work with groupings like ASEAN, like NATO, like APEC, that he might, we don't know, that he might try to find ways to resolve some of the tensions with China by working with some of these countries that I mentioned, particularly the Germany, the Japan's, the ones that have big trade with China, that pressure them on things like intellectual property rights, pressure them on things like state-owned enterprises, and not use tariffs for all the solutions. But, the Southeast Asians, 4 Southeast Asian countries are members of the newly dubbed Trans-Pacific Partnership, but there's almost no chance that a Biden would go back to that after the very strong rise of bipartisan frustration with trade, a lot of protectionism. Biden even has a policy to buy American, sounding awful lot like Trump in some ways. It would be certainly a nicer, gentler regime, but it would not necessarily bury the hatchet totally with China.
Right. Sebastian, your thoughts on that as well? What are the prospects for Southeast Asia in a Trump 2 or in a Joe Biden administration?
Well, in general, I tend to view U.S.-China competition in structural terms. I know that, the nature of the Chinese Communist regime does shape its engagement with the outside world to some considerable extent. But I think, what we have is the world's second largest economy, soon to eclipse what has been the world's largest economy since the Second World War. And in doing so, challenging a lot of core ideological and tenets that Americans hold about their nation's exceptional role in the world. And I think that challenge would be there regardless of who is in power. As it turns out, it was Donald Trump who provided the catalyst for a far-reaching and bipartisan reassessment of China. And, this is not just a matter of the Trump administration. In Washington, D.C. today, this turn against China, this souring of attitudes towards China, stretches across the political spectrum from Senator Elizabeth Warren to Steve Bannon on the right. And so I think what we're likely to see with the Joe Biden administration, if he is elected, is, that competition will continue to remain the keynote of the American relationship with China. However, I agree with Murray that within that broad framework of competition and rivalry, we'll probably see a more sophisticated balance between engaging China where it is mutually beneficial. We'll probably see an end to self-defeating economic measures, and we'll see, in general, more coherence within the strategy, the ability to work with partners and allies without alienating them through the levying of tariffs and other outbursts on social media by the president. So I think that it will there'll probably be more continuity than change, but we'll see a certain level-headedness and coherence re-injected into American China policy.
Okay, Murray, you mentioned the Mekong, and I'm glad you did that because I've also spent a lot of time there, as you know. Now, under Barack Obama, of course, there was this Lower Mekong Initiative. The U.S. did give some funding and so forth, but it was seen as, not all that amazing, frankly. It didn't sort of shift the game massively. Do you think the U.S. should do more in the Mekong region?
I would argue for the U.S. doing more, and maybe not only by itself, but also working with Japan, Australia, and other countries to help develop the Mekong, the Lower Mekong. But we also, I think now, the problem is becoming we have to help figure out the water problem, because if China holds back all the water, then the Tonle Sap in Cambodia, which, as you know, it during rainy season it expands into a big lake, and then when the rains stop, it contracts, and the river flows the opposite direction. And in that process, there's an awful lot of fish spawning, and that is really just not been happening last year, and it's probably not going to happen this year. And it's also very hard on the Mekong Delta in southern Vietnam, where the lack of silt coming down the Mekong, and the lack of water result in increased salinization of the land in the Delta, which is much of it's below sea level. So I think ultimately, yes, China has spent hundreds of millions of dollars on aid projects, doing something like 300 aid projects, but the ultimate cost is to the 60 million farmers that live along the Mekong, whose livelihoods are being increasingly challenged by water being held up further north.
Right. Sebastian, a last quick question to you before we wrap up. One, there's this sort of, it's become a bit of a trope that the U.S. has sort of retreated. There are signs of a U.S. retreat from the region. Of course, the U.S. pulled out of TPP. It's pulled out of multilateral arrangements like the JCPOA in Iran, the WHO recently. But China doesn't have everything to itself. I mean, it doesn't have the powerful allies the U.S. has. China has Cambodia, Laos, Pakistan, North Korea maybe, whereas the U.S. has got a really serious string of powerful allies. So is this slightly overdone in the region, this anxiety over the U.S.'s apparent retreat? Do you buy that line? Or is the U.S. actually going it alone but doing it pretty robustly? I mean, they have been, as we have mentioned in this conversation, President Trump has been the first one to really muster this consensus and challenge China. What are your thoughts on that?
It's somewhere in the middle. I think that what the Trump administration has done definitely is, a more robust policy towards China. I think one of the concern that I heard in Southeast Asia when I was researching this book is that, the Trump administration is eyeing Beijing beadily across the Pacific Ocean, but the lands that lie between the nations of Southeast Asia and the Pacific are being in some senses overlooked. That everything is now being channeled through the lens of U.S.-China competition. And a lot of America's engagement in Southeast Asia is being framed in those terms as well. So, there was a lot of concern about, there has been a lot of concern about the absenteeism of senior American officials from the region. And the very narrow focus on what is perceived to be a very narrow focus on the South China Sea and military engagement. And I think that this is an issue that, to a certain extent, all large powers have. The Chinese are also eyeing off the Americans and, to a large extent, view their relationships in Southeast Asia, again, through the lens of this burgeoning great power competition. And I think but I think, with the U.S., you have the issue of geographic distance as well, which, makes it very difficult for American administrations to find the right balance between engaging with the region, but not being perceived as sort of being too aggressive and and asking too much of their partners and allies in the region. So I think that, there's certainly the engagement has been robust, but I think there needs to be more attention to Southeast Asian interests and Southeast Asian concerns.
Quick last word from you, Murray, on that same question. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting. Like Sebastian, I spend a lot of time talking to Southeast Asians the last 2 years, and I guess what I hear is there's like Sebastian said, that the U.S. is too focused on China and that they're viewing us through the China prism. But they really do say that the U.S. is too sporadically involved in the region. So you'll have brief flashes of time when the U.S. will show up at all the meetings, be interested in looking for new opportunities to cooperate, provide maritime domain awareness capabilities to Vietnam and the Philippines, and then it sort of disappears again for a while. And so they're not there, but like you pointed out, the question is, are the Southeast Asians a little bit too paranoid? But the other thing you have to say is that the U.S. has a lot on its plate when it's dealing with the Middle East and Iran and Russia and just all kinds of problems. It's hard to keep focusing on Southeast Asia all the time.
Right. Okay. Murray Hiebert, Sebastian Strangio, once again, congratulations on your respective books. Excellent reading. I really hope that a lot of people read them, because it's really it's a story of our times, really, and it brings the story of Southeast Asia up to date. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nirmal.
During the Cold War, Southeast Asia had to perform a very complex balancing act between great powers. Following the Cold War, following the end of the Vietnam War, came a period of relative stability and prosperity. Today, once again, Southeast Asia finds itself in the middle of a rising China and the United States of America. This is one of the most critical stories of our time. For Asian Insider, I'm Nirmal Ghosh.